welcome to FieldPartner. We're really glad that you could join us again for another of these interviews, each one unique, as the storyteller themselves is unique. And we're so glad that we can share these stories month by month. As always, we ask that you would look at the rest of the resources on FieldPartner, because you'll find lots there that is valuable at whatever stage you might be in your cross-cultural journey, or if you yourself are not working cross-culturally and are supporting those who are, then you will find lots there to help you as well. Do like us on Facebook, and do let us others know that we're here. So today I have the pleasure of introducing Joanne Pittman, and I'm very grateful that she has given us the time to share. So I'm just going to share briefly what her bio says. She works for a group called China Source, which is a resource ministry dedicated to providing the global Christian community with objective information about the church in China. She's Vice President for Partnerships and China Engagement and the editor of ZG Briefs. Prior to joining China Source, Joanne spent 28 years working in China as an English teacher, language student, program director, and cross-cultural trainer for organizations and businesses engaged in China. She also taught Chinese at the University of Northwestern St. Paul in Minnesota, Chinese Culture and Communication at Wheaton College, Illinois, and Taylor University, Indiana. She's the author of The Bells Are Not Silent, Stories of Church Bells in China, and her personal blog, Outside In, can be found at joannpittman.com, where she writes on China, Minnesota, traveling, and issues relating to living well where you don't belong. I love that. You can find her on Twitter and on Facebook, and currently she makes her home at St. Paul, Minnesota. So Joanne, welcome. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Okay, so as always in these interviews, we would wonder if you could start at the beginning and tell us where you're from and how you came to faith and all things like that.
Okay, well, I'm a TCK. So the question, where are you from, as you know, is often a sort of like, I don't know how to answer that. But I was born and raised in Pakistan, where my parents were missionaries. My father was a seminary professor and pastoral trainer. So I was born and raised in Pakistan, and my family moved to Minnesota when I was 14, so in the early 1970s, and where my father was a professor here as well. And so it's easy to question for me. I'm from Minnesota in the US, but as I said, I'm born and raised overseas. I became a Christian at a young age, and through the influence of my parents and my church in Karachi, Pakistan, and just very grateful to have been raised in a family where faith was important, where scripture was important, where the gospel was important, and then the heritage of parents who themselves were missionaries.
That's wonderful. I share that heritage too.
Yeah.
That's great. So obviously then the next question is, if your roots are in Pakistan, how come you landed up working in China, and what led to that part of your journey?
Well, I think that maybe the easy answer is God has a sense of humor. And, China is an interesting place. China was always sort of on the periphery of my growing up years in Pakistan, because in the 1960s, Pakistan and China were friends. And that was during the Cold War, when very few countries had relationships with China, but Pakistan did. Right. So there was always sort of, stuff going back and forth between Pakistan and China. Every morning when my mom would drive my sister and I to school in Karachi, we would pass the Chinese consulate. And, there was a big picture of Chairman Mao hanging on the side of the building. And so, it was always there. And, we used to talk about maybe going and visiting, because you could do that, but it never happened. Then I moved back to the States, went to college. And in 1979, I had the opportunity to go to Hong Kong for a summer missions trip and kind of an internship. And I had never been to East Asia, having I'd grown up in South Asia, but I didn't know anything about East Asia. So I went, and and it was to work with the church and do English classes and stuff for youth at the church. So I went to Hong Kong for that summer, and then in addition to working with the youth at the church, I was asked to help out at a center called the Chinese Church Research Center.
Okay.
run by Jonathan Zhao.
Right.
And
Yeah.
in 1979, he had just come back from a survey trip into mainland China. And he was one of the first outsiders to be able to go into China and just sort of see what was the state of the church, because this was right after the Cultural Revolution. Well, the Cultural Revolution was just winding down. And well, in 76 it ended, but to go back in and say, what's the state of the church? And he had dictated all of his notes as he traveled around China. And so they needed a native English speaker in the office to come in and transcribe all of his dictations.
Wow.
And so I did that. And I had no idea what I was listening to. I didn't know anything about Chinese history, but I just remember God beginning to say, pay attention here. And then, but I had no idea the significance of what I was doing. And then that summer, China opened for Western tourists to go in. And so I went with some other American college students that were in the city. And we went on a 3-day tour into Guangzhou. Back then it was like, going into, Red China is what we called it back then. And I just remember being fascinated. And I remember thinking, wow, if China continues to open up, maybe there would be an opportunity to, come here and work and do something here. And just kind of tucked it away and went back to college, earned a degree. And then in 1983, I heard about an organization that was actually going to send English teachers to China, a Christian organization. So I signed up. And I went to China in 84 for what I thought was going to be 1 year of teaching English. And I moved back to the United States in 2012. So, God just put China on my heart and enabled me to stay for many years. And it was a privilege.
So as part of that was teaching. How many years was it actually teaching?
Well, actually, I only taught for a couple of years. And so I taught for a couple of years and I came home to the US for a few years and got a master's degree. And then I went back in 1990 with a nice, tidy plan to to study Chinese for a couple of years, and then just go, teach on a university campus somewhere. And the organization that I was with had a language program at a school in Northeast China. And I ended up becoming the director of that program. So I went from English teaching to a student studying Chinese to directing a language program for Americans who were studying Chinese. And I did that through the 90s. So the 90s, I lived up in Changchun. And then in 98, I moved to Beijing, where I joined the leadership team of my organization. And that's when it was. And then in 1995, I started doing all of the cross-cultural training for the teachers that we were bringing in every year, 300 to 400. And so I was teaching Chinese language, culture, history, cross-cultural adjustment, things like that.
Wow. So, that brings up another question then as to, did you receive that kind of training yourself before you went, or was this all stuff that you learned along the way that you were
I would say the answer to that question is yes. Before I went, the organization that I went with, they had an orientation program. So, they sent us books to read. There weren't a lot of books about China, though, back in the 1980s, to be honest with you. There were just a few. And then, they brought in people who did know about China and cross-cultural stuff. So it was minimal. But I did have some skills because I'd grown up overseas, but I really got into the field of culture and language training, obviously language training, when I was director of the language program. But in 1994, I think it was, 1994 or 95, I had the opportunity to do an internship at Link Care in California, which is an organization that does member care and counseling services for missionaries and pastors. And at that time, they were working with Don Larson. And Don Larson was, he was kind of a language acquisition guru in the 1960s and 70s. He pioneered the barefoot language learning method. And Link Care was running a pre-field orientation program for missionaries going overseas. I think it was a 4 or 5 week program. Oh. And I was able to go out there and work with Brent Lindquist, who is the president of Link Care, and Don Larson, who was the language learning and culture learning person. And I did an internship with them. So that's where I got it wasn't formal training. I didn't come out with a certificate, but it was pretty intensive. And then got into doing it with the organization that I work for. I became the sort of cross-cultural, intercultural trainer for them.
Well, I remember Amy singing your praises. I imagine was there other feedback that you were given from people who went through the program as to how much it helped them?
Yeah, people did respond positively. And I think what I tried to do in my training is just to impress on people the importance of taking culture and language learning seriously. Right. And I kind of became known within the organization, as the culture lady. If you have a question of China or Chinese culture, go talk to her. And it's very satisfying. I still stay in touch with a lot of the people that came into China in the 90s and 2000s. They came for a couple of years. Many of them stayed and taught and worked in China for many, many years. Many of them became fluent. There's a few students of mine. I had one person who came in as an English teacher. He was going to just teach in China for a couple of years. I taught him to say ni hao in Chinese the first day in China, and he went on and got a master's. He got a master's degree in Chinese philosophy from a Chinese university. Oh. And a PhD in Chinese philosophy. And every time I see him or hear him talk, I'm like, he's my student. So, so in some ways, I feel very blessed that mm-hmm. I have been able to influence people about the importance of taking language and culture learning seriously.
Right. Okay. So my next question was about that, because I was saying that I had gone on to so Amy Young and Global Trellis are another of our partners. And I was browsing through their site and I came across this course on language learning by Joanne Pittman. And so I was wanting her to speak on the importance of that, because you can't really access the culture as well, or even really at all, unless you have the language as well, would you say?
Yeah, I don't think you can access the culture without learning the language. I think a person can live and work in another culture and maybe teach English or do a job and have interesting opportunities for ministry with English speakers. But if you really want to be long-term, if you really want to be accepted into the society as a member of the term that's often used is be a part of the speech community. Mm. You have to know the language. Or otherwise you just live outside. I'm very much influenced by Greg Thompson's concept of joining the speech community. Right. And that's what language learning is. It's not just, language isn't just a tool that you get so you can do something. No. It's joining a speech community. And I'm also influenced obviously by Don Larson, a concept that he taught, which is this concept of being an acceptable outsider. In that when you live cross-culturally, there's no way to become an insider. In China, obviously you can't, because there are Chinese people and there are foreign people, and they're just two different categories, and you can't cross them. So you're always an outsider. So for those of you who are, watching this, who've been in China, you're a La Wai, you're a Waiguoren. So what does that mean? As a Waiguoren, should I be trying to become a Zhongguoren, a Chinese? I can't. So Larson was really influential to me in this concept of becoming an acceptable outsider. What does that mean? He is an outsider, but yeah, they're good. We can accept them as outsiders into our community. So I think that learning the language is one of the most important things you can do to be that acceptable outsider that gives you access then to the speech community.
And really that needs to happen at the very start. We say that you never get a second opportunity at a first impression. Likewise with language, if you don't really get it at the beginning, it's very hard to recapture it later.
It is. The earlier you can do it, the better. And obviously the older we get, the harder it gets.
That too.
If you're heading overseas, do the best you can to try to get working on the language as quickly as possible.
Right. And so that means from the sender point of view, they need to have a realistic understanding of how long adjustment is going to take if you have a language to learn.
Yes. Yeah, languages are not easy. I mean, for native English speakers, some languages can be learned more quickly than others. Obviously, Spanish would be like fairly quickly learned by a native English speaker. However, Chinese is one of those languages that takes a long time. Russian is a language that's particularly difficult for English speakers. Arabic, and it can't be rushed.
No. So patience is needed for the person going and for the person sending as well. So what other advice would you give to someone who's wondering about moving to another culture?
I would say you need to go into your cross-cultural sojourn with the attitude of a learner. And I think this can sometimes be difficult for people who are missionaries or their faith-based work overseas, because especially people who are missionaries, they're going because they have something to say. I have a story to tell. Right. As the song goes, I have a story to tell to the nations. Yeah, which is a great story and it's a great thing. But sometimes that can get in the way of, or we sometimes forget that we need to be learners as well. Mm-hmm. And that adopting a posture of learner is a way to be an acceptable outsider so that the message will be more likely received. Yeah, so true. So even if maybe you're at a point where you say, I think God might be calling me to China or Indonesia, and you don't know when and you don't know where, you can still be a learner. You can start reading. You can dabble in the language. You can take a history course. You can do things to prepare. Yeah. That very early on establish yourself as a learner. Mm-hmm. Or even find people from that nation in your own neighborhood that you can reach out to. Because I think most of us live in places now where we can find people from pretty much anywhere in our communities. Yeah, that's right. So, Joanne, at some point you must have decided the time had come to leave China. Can you say what led to that decision? And yes, it was in 2012, and my father had passed away 11 years previous, and my mother was 86, and I felt I needed to return to the States to help her. I didn't want to come back to the States when it was an emergency. As she entered her, elderly years, shall we say. So I came back to sort of help take care of her, and she's 94 now. Wow. And actually doing very well. That's brilliant. That's wonderful. But what was your experience of re-entry? Did you find it difficult after all those years in China to back in the US? In some ways it was, in some ways it wasn't. One of the things is that all the years that I was in China, we worked and lived on the academic calendar. So, and the schools that we worked at didn't want us around. So I came back to the States every summer for a couple of months. So I was always going back. I wasn't as out of touch with life in America as, say, was the case when I was a kid in the 60s and we came back every 4 years. Then it was like, whoa, what's this? So I was already familiar, and I had gotten to a point where I could sort of flip a switch So when, okay, now I'm in the US, I have to, I know the rules here, the cultural rules. And when I go back to China, I know the cultural rules there, because really cross-cultural adjustment is about figuring out the cultural rules. And so I kind of knew them. So I would just, okay, China rules, America rules. And the other thing that I did that I think was helpful and I would recommend is that I had been for so many years training people on how to manage a cultural adjustment from their home culture to to the host culture. Principles, activities, mindsets, attitudes. And I thought, well, why don't I just turn all those around and try to approach adjusting to life here using the same principles that I did, or in some cases did not, but I certainly was teaching. It's like, because it's all the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just tried to turn everything that I'd been training upside down and apply it to life here.
Excellent. What a really good thing.
Yeah.
We all need
I think it helped.
We've yet to make our final transition back to this country, so I'm taking note.
Yes.
So I gather you're also an author. So tell us about the book, The Bells Are Not Silent. What brought you to write that, and what lies behind?
Yeah, that's an interesting interesting story. I'll try to give you the short version. In 2012, I had the opportunity to travel around Southwest China with my pastor's wife from my church here in Minneapolis. And my church in Minneapolis had sent a single woman to China as a missionary in 1925. And this woman named Esther Nelson had served in China from 25 to 51 when she, along with her colleagues, were kicked out. And during the time she was in China, she had sent letters back to the church. And so my pastor's wife, who's a bit of a historian and she's an author herself, she said, I want to go back to this area and research the life of this woman and look for her legacy. And so she said, would you come along as my translator? I'm like, yeah, that sounds like fun. So we were traveling in Southwest China. And we were at a church in Yibin in Sichuan province. And we were meeting with a pastor of a registered church in that city that we're 99% sure had been started by Baptist missionaries in the 1800s, and that it was a church from which Esther Nelson ministered. So we were wanting to talk to the pastor. What did he know about the history of the church? And he wanted to know from us, what did we know? And in the course of the conversation, the pastor turned to me and said, we have a bell up in our steeple, but it has English on it, and we can't read it. Would you help translate it for us? So we said, yeah. So we climbed up into this, to the steeple of this church, and there was this giant bell hanging way, way up, much higher than we were. And so my Chinese friend who was translating, because I actually don't speak Sichuan dialect, so I wasn't that useful as a translator. He climbed up and started reading the inscription on the bell. And the inscription was Buckeye Bell Foundry, Cincinnati, Ohio, presented to the First Baptist Church of Coffeyville, Kansas, by W.S. Upham, 1863, praise ye the Lord. And we were flabbergasted, as you can imagine. And, just like, how did this bell from Ohio go to Kansas, end up in Southwest China? It's almost 150 years old. So we were stunned. And because I studied Chinese history, and I'm thinking about the Great Leap Forward in China, when they basically told everybody, melt all your metal, and we'll make bombs and retake Taiwan. And so I was just like, how in the world did this bell survive, and what's the story? So I asked the pastor, said, how did this happen? And he said, well, we got a phone call from the Religious Affairs Bureau, and they said we could have our bell back. And we didn't know we had a bell. It had been taken during the Cultural Revolution and or the Great Leap Forward sometime. It had been taken away and used in a factory. And I looked at him and I said, how did this survive the Great Leap Forward? And he said, oh, he said, they tried to burn it, but it was too strong.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, just like the church in China,
Yeah.
they tried to burn it, but it was too strong. So for me, at
And
that
that's
moment,
cool.
the church bell became a symbol for God's faithfulness to
Mm.
the church in China. But then I also thought, if there's one bell with a story like that, there's others. And then I spent the next 6 months traveling around China looking for church bells. And my book is a story of 10 church bells that I found. And
How
it's
amazing.
really the story of God's faithfulness to the church in China as
Right.
told through the stories of 10 bells.
How amazing.
And it's available only on Amazon.
I shall look, definitely read that. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we really need to wind up, but I just wondered whether you could offer your opinion on the current situation that we're all facing. COVID has definitely changed the landscape as far as cross-cultural missions is concerned. And in China, the political scene has altered drastically as well. So what do you see as the impact of those two factors on missions generally and on working in China in particular?
Oh, wow, that's a hard question because no, yeah, it's a hard question. I think for the foreigners, Westerners who, not just Westerners, but non-Chinese who want to work in China, I think in the near term, it's going to continue to be very difficult to get in. Essentially, the borders of China right now are closed to foreigners.
Mm-hmm.
They're not issuing tourist visas, so there is no international tourism. So you can't go in as a tourist. Work permits, work visas are being given out very, very sparingly because China has adopted a COVID zero policy. They don't want any COVID, and foreigners bring in COVID. So the borders are essentially closed. So I think in the near term, I don't talk to anybody who thinks that the borders will reopen before the fall of next year.
Wow.
That would be the earliest. I hope I am wrong. I would love for somebody to come back and say, you were wrong on that.
Yeah.
I really hope I'm wrong, but that's kind of the conventional wisdom out there right now. So I think for foreigners, it's going to continue to be difficult to get into China. There are things that can be done from outside of China. Despite what we hear, Chinese Christians can still access training and other kinds of materials online outside of China. Technology has changed the way they're doing things. Chinese Christians are connecting with Christians abroad via Zoom. They're doing church online in China on Zoom and different platforms. And what happens is, the government might shut something down over here, and then everybody just moves over here. So, they've gone through some of the struggles that we in the West have. Is how do you do church when you can't meet? I think they had a longer time when they couldn't meet. But I think the main thing that I would say is that in the outside of China, we hear mostly about the restrictions, which are real. We hear about the crackdowns, which are real. We hear about the increased persecution, which are real. We hear about all the things that Chinese Christians can't do. But in China, Christians are actually going about doing things. They are trying to figure out how to do things in a much more difficult environment, but they're doing it. And so they are, they're holding, they're encouraging one another online. They're still getting together where they can, still sending people out of the country. I mean, it's just, as my Chinese friend said, everything's harder, but we're still doing things. It's just harder. So I think we need to, I think those of us outside China, obviously need to continue to pray. And then, ask the Lord for us to be willing to say, okay, in this new environment where we cannot be there, what might you have for us in a role that's more serving the church? And so we need to keep informed on what they're doing, what their needs are, the victories they're having. And it's just, God's not done with China.
No, certainly not.
Yeah, he's still working in amazing ways.
Okay, so Joanne, last question. You have kindly agreed to partner with us, and we were just
Yes.
talking a little bit about what that might look like. So, could you share with us what you think we can do to help you, and also, what other ways we can network together?
Okay, yeah, we've been talking for quite a while on this, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to partner with FieldPartner from China Source, and so I think what we can do is, we would love to hear your stories. We would love to hear your perspectives, and we have a website where we publish 5 times a week new content about Christianity in China, about the issues that facing the church in China, about issues related to cross-cultural adjustment, both Westerners going overseas or maybe Chinese themselves going out. We would love to hear your perspective. So obviously, we invite you to contribute for us, and then we can help be a platform for you to share with the broader ministry community the resources that you have. That's really what we like to do, is to say, hey, these people over here, they're doing great stuff. Pay attention to them. We get really excited about doing that kind of thing in China Source. I would be happy to highlight especially some of your content and resources in our weekly China newsletter called ZG Briefs, and where we curate news stories from China out in the course of a week, as well as resources. So we'll be happy to do that. Obviously, if you're looking for connections, we love to network at China Source. We love to hear about somebody doing one thing and they're doing the same thing. Do you know each other? Okay, great. You two need to talk. I think in our conversation, I have a list of about 3 or 4 people I want to introduce you to already. So,
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And then for our part, we want to showcase what you have done in terms of resources and so on. So look out for that page on the FieldPartner website where we're showcasing China Source and everything that that they want us to share with you. Okay,
it's going to be great.
So, well, thanks, Joanne, so much. There's a lot of food for thought there, and I know many people will be blessed by hearing what you've had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, and so thank you to you two for joining us. That's the end of this interview. But do as we say, go back to the website and to the Facebook site as well. And do look at all the things, ways of connecting with Joanne, from including that personal blog site with. I love that, about thriving where you don't belong or something. Was that?
Yep, that's another term I borrowed from Don Larson. Living well where you don't belong.
Yes, excellent, wonderful, love it. Okay, bye then, and God bless.
Thank you.
For joining us.